The damage to Bush's presidency is severe and lasting. His approval rating, already dropping due to the Iraq War, plummets from 45% to 38% and never really recovers. Michael Brown, the FEMA director Bush had famously praised with the following quote,
"And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job,"
resigns in disgrace on September 12th. On September 15th, Bush delivers a national address from New Orleans where he takes responsibility for federal failures, saying the government's response was not acceptable, a rare admission for a president who rarely acknowledged mistakes. Congressional investigations expose years of neglect of New Orleans levees, inadequate disaster planning, and the hollowing out of FEMA's capabilities.
Hurricane Katrina made its first landfall in southeast Florida.
It's September 2nd, 2005. NBC Studios, New York City. The nation is watching a celebrity telethon to raise money for Hurricane Katrina victims. Millions of Americans are tuned in. Mike Myers, the comedian, is reading from the teleprompter about the disaster. Next to him stands Kanye West, one of the biggest stars in music. However, he is fidgeting and looks agitated. Myers finishes his scripted line. Kanye's turn, but he's not reading the prompter. His voice cracks with emotion as he says the following.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
The control room erupts in chaos. Producers scramble to cut away, but it's too late. The words are out, broadcast live to millions, and they will define how an entire generation remembers one of America's worst natural disasters. I'm Charles Denyer, and this is Chasing Power, where we break down the moments, the scandals, the battles, and the players that shape American politics, both past and present. Today's episode, Kanye, Katrina, and the accusation that shook a presidency.
Welcome to Chasing Power, the path to Pennsylvania Avenue, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The audacity of hope. America, you've vindicated that hope.
And we will make America great again.
To understand why Kanye West's 7 words became one of the defining statements about the Bush presidency, you need to know 3 things. First, Hurricane Katrina wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a catastrophic failure of government at every level. On August 29, 2005, a Category 3 hurricane slammed into the Gulf Coast with 125-mile-per-hour winds. But the real devastation came when the levees in New Orleans failed the next day, flooding 80% of the city. Thousands of mostly poor, mostly African-American residents who could not evacuate found themselves trapped on rooftops, wading through toxic floodwater, or packed into the Superdome in increasingly desperate conditions. Bodies floated in the streets. People died waiting for help that took days to arrive.
Take a look. This is the scene today. Tens of thousands of people massing at the Superdome, hoping to be one of the lucky ones who manages to get out of the disaster zone before succumbing to hunger, thirst.
The images shocked the world and exposed the vulnerability of America's infrastructure and the deep racial and economic inequalities that the floodwaters literally brought to the surface. Second, the federal response was disastrously slow and incompetent. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was supposed to coordinate disaster relief, but under Director Michael Brown, a political appointee whose previous job was judging horse shows, the agency was unprepared and overwhelmed. President Bush stayed on vacation in Crawford, Texas for 2 days after the storm hit. When he finally left, he flew over New Orleans, but on Air Force One, looking down at the devastation from 30,000 feet rather than landing. That image, Bush peering out of a window while people suffered below, became symbolic of his detachment.
Superdome was deplorable. There were a lot of looting going on. Some crimes were committed. The worst thing I saw was the conditions of the bathrooms. It was to the point where the smell was vomiting. The hallways, we actually started camping outside so that we could breathe.
Meanwhile, survivors were still being rescued from rooftops 5 days after the storm, and reports of violence, looting, chaos, and even murder dominated cable news. Third, The victims were overwhelmingly African American and poor, and the racial dimensions of the disaster were impossible to ignore. Before Katrina, New Orleans was 67% African American, and many of those who couldn't evacuate were among the city's poorest residents who lacked cars, money, or anywhere to go. The images broadcast into American living rooms showed predominantly black faces in distress, and the national conversation quickly turned to whether the response would have been faster if the victims had been white and middle class. That's the context when Kanye West decided to speak his mind on live television. Now, here's what happened. September 2nd, 2005, 8:35 p.m. Eastern Time. NBC is broadcasting a concert for hurricane relief, a star-studded telethon to raise money for victims. The show features performances and appeals from celebrities reading carefully scripted messages. Kanye West, who at the peak of his early fame, is paired with Mike Myers to read a segment about the disaster's impact on children and families. Myers delivers his lines perfectly.
The shape of the city has changed dramatically, tragically, and perhaps irreversibly. There's now over 25 feet of water where there was once city streets and thriving neighborhoods.
Kanye is supposed to read the next scripted paragraph. Instead, he goes completely off script. His voice tight with emotion, he says the following.
I hate the way they portray us in the media. If you see a black family, it says they're looting. See a white family, it says they're looking for food.
Myers, visibly uncomfortable, tries to recover, reading his next line about monetary donations. Kanye ignores him and continues.
And you know, it's been 5 days because most of the people are black.
Myers stumbles through his next line, clearly rattled. Then Kanye delivers the words that will echo through history.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Dead silence. Meyer freezes. His face looks like a mask of shock. The camera immediately cuts away to Chris Tucker. In the control room, producers are screaming. NBC will later edit the statement out of the West Coast broadcast. But on the East Coast, millions heard it. And in the age of early internet viral moments, the clip will be everywhere by morning. But here's what made this so explosive. Kanye wasn't a politician or a pundit. He was a pop culture icon, saying what millions of black Americans were thinking, but few public figures were willing to say so bluntly on national television. So immediately, cable news plays the clip on loop. Conservative commentators accuse Kanye of being divisive and inappropriate during a charity event. Liberal voices defend him as speaking an uncomfortable truth. NBC issues a statement saying Kanye's opinions were his own and did not reflect the network's views. The White House initially stays silent, but the story dominates the news cycle for days, overshadowing the actual fundraising effort, for which the telethon ultimately raised $50 million. As for Kanye, he receives death threats, but he also receives support from thousands who felt he gave voice to their anger and frustration. The statement forces a national conversation about race, poverty, and disaster response that the administration had been trying to avoid. The damage to Bush's presidency is severe and lasting. His approval rating, already dropping due to the Iraq War, plummets from 45% to 38% and never really recovers. Michael Brown, the FEMA director Bush had famously praised with the following quote,
"And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job,"
resigns in disgrace on September 12th. On September 15th, Bush delivers a national address from New Orleans where he takes responsibility for federal failures, saying the government's response was not acceptable, a rare admission for a president who rarely acknowledged mistakes. Congressional investigations expose years of neglect of New Orleans levees, inadequate disaster planning, and the hollowing out of FEMA's capabilities. In 2010, during an interview with Matt Lauer, George W. Bush addressed Kanye West's remarks publicly for the first time.
That says he's a racist. And I didn't appreciate it then, and I don't appreciate it now. It's one thing to say, I don't appreciate the way he's handled his business. It's another thing to say this man's a racist. I resent it. It's not true. And it was one of the most disgusting moments of my presidency.
By then, Bush had already written in his memoir, Decision Points, that the comment was the lowest moment of my presidency. Not because of its policy implications, but because it struck at his sense of personal morality. Bush emphasized that being accused of racism wounded him more deeply than any political failure, a reaction that stood in stark contrast to the wars, the financial collapse, and the national trauma that otherwise defined his time as President of the United States. Katrina became the turning point where Bush's presidency shifted from post-9/11 strength to lame duck weakness. The disaster exposed the consequences of appointing unqualified political lobbyists to critical positions and prioritizing tax cuts over infrastructure investment. FEMA was eventually reformed and professionalized again, but the lessons of coastal vulnerabilities, antiquated levees, and the need to protect vulnerable communities remain relevant even today. Now, Bush defenders make several arguments worth considering. They point out that the initial failures were primarily at the state and local level. Mayor Ray Nagin waited too long to order mandatory evacuation, and Governor Kathleen Blanco delayed requesting federal military assistance due to bureaucratic confusion about command authority. They note that the federal government eventually mobilized the largest domestic disaster response in U.S. history, with over 50,000 National Guard troops deployed and billions in aid authorized. Some argue that Kanye's statement was unfair and inflammatory, reducing a complex disaster involving failures at multiple levels of government to a simple charge of racism. They contend that Bush genuinely cared about the victims, but was hampered by a dysfunctional bureaucracy, and that the accusation ignored his record on AIDS relief in Africa and his appointment of black officials to high-level positions. To be fair, there's a legitimate debate about whether Bush's failures were due to racial indifferences or to simple incompetence, cronyism, and ideological hostility to effective government. This I do know from firsthand experience. George W. Bush was not a cruel man, and he most certainly was not a racist. Kanye, who became increasingly unpredictable and controversial, visited Trump Tower in 2016 wearing a Make America Great Again hat, and later said he regretted his Katrina statement, calling it too emotional. Then, in classic Kanye fashion, he seemed to reverse again in subsequent years. The two men's strange journey, from that moment of searing criticism to apparent reconciliation to confusion, mirrors America's own inability to reckon clearly with what Katrina revealed about poverty, race, and who matters when disaster strikes. The question Kanye raised, who does the government care about, remains unanswered every time another storm hits and the poor are left behind. I'm Charles Denyer. Thanks for chasing power with me.
All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any political organization, government agency, or private institution. This podcast is for news reporting, commentary, and criticism. We use excerpts, clips, and quotations from political events and other copyrighted works under the Fair Use Doctrine. All rights in those works remain with their respective owners. The views expressed are our own and do not represent any other entity.